The lunch bell rang at Jefferson Middle School, and 12-year-old David packed up his math homework with a sigh of relief. Numbers had never been his favorite subject, but at least now he could look forward to his mom's homemade turkey sandwich. She had woken up early that morning, just like every other morning, to make sure he had a proper lunch before heading off to her first job at the local diner. David walked through the crowded hallways, dodging groups of kids rushing toward the cafeteria. The smell of pizza and chicken nuggets filled the air, mixing with the sounds of laughter and chatter that echoed off the walls. He found his usual spot at a table near the window, where the afternoon sun streamed in and made everything feel a little warmer. As he unwrapped his sandwich, David noticed something that made him pause. At the table next to him, a boy named Kevin sat alone, staring down at the empty space in front of him. Kevin's hands were folded in his lap, and he kept glancing around the cafeteria with a look that David recognized all too well. It was the same look David had seen in the mirror during those tough months last year when his dad lost his job and money was really tight. Kevin had always been quiet in their English class, but lately he seemed different, more withdrawn. His clothes looked a little too big for him, and David had noticed that Kevin often seemed tired during their morning classes. Now, seeing Kevin sitting there with no food while everyone around him ate, David felt something twist in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. David took a bite of his sandwich and watched as Kevin pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his backpack. It looked like homework, but David could tell Kevin was just pretending to be busy, so no one would notice he wasn't eating. The way Kevin's shoulders hunched forward, the way he avoided making eye contact with anyone, it all reminded David of himself during those difficult times. Without really thinking about it, David stood up and walked over to Kevin's table. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" he asked, even though he was already pulling out the chair across from Kevin. Kevin looked up, surprised. "Oh, sure," he said quietly, quickly stuffing the paper back into his backpack. David sat down and unwrapped his sandwich again. His mom had packed it with extra turkey, just the way he liked it, and she had included an apple and a small bag of chips. It was more food than he usually ate, actually. His mom always worried that he wasn't eating enough, especially since his growth spurt started. "You know," David said, trying to sound casual, "my mom always packs way too much food. She thinks I'm still going through some major growth phase or something." He laughed and shook his head. "I swear sometimes I think she forgets I'm not a linebacker on the football team." Kevin smiled a little at that, but David could see the sadness in his eyes. It was the kind of sadness that came from trying to be strong when everything felt like it was falling apart. David broke his sandwich in half and pushed one part across the table toward Kevin. "Want to help me out? I honestly can't finish all this, and it's really good. My mom makes the best sandwiches in the world." Kevin stared at the sandwich for a moment, and David could see him struggling with himself. Pride was a funny thing, David knew. It could keep you warm when you had nothing else, but it could also keep you from accepting help when you really needed it. "I don't know," Kevin said softly. "I'm not really that hungry." David knew that wasn't true. He could hear Kevin's stomach growling from across the small table. "Come on, man. You'd actually be doing me a favor. If I don't eat all this, my mom's going to think I didn't like it, and then she'll start experimenting with weird health food stuff. Last time that happened, I got quinoa salad for 2 weeks straight." That got a real laugh out of Kevin, and some of the tension in his shoulders seemed to relax. "Quinoa salad sounds terrible," he admitted. "It was worse than terrible," David said dramatically. "It was a crime against lunchboxes everywhere." He pushed the apple across the table too. "Please save me from quinoa salad." "Eat something." Kevin hesitated for another moment, then reached for the sandwich half. "Thanks," he said quietly. And David could hear the gratitude in that simple word. As Kevin took his first bite, David saw something change in his face. It wasn't just relief at finally having food, though that was certainly part of it. It was something deeper. It was the realization that someone had noticed, someone had cared enough to share what they had without making a big deal about it. "This is really good," Kevin said after swallowing his first bite. "Right? My mom's secret is this honey mustard stuff she makes herself. She won't tell me the recipe because she says I'm too young to be trusted with family secrets." David took a bite of his own half and grinned. "I think she just doesn't want me making sandwiches better than hers." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and David watched as some color returned to Kevin's face. It was amazing what a little food could do, but David knew it was about more than just the nutrition. Sometimes knowing that someone cared enough to share made all the difference. "So how's Mrs. Patterson's English class treating you?" David asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Kevin rolled his eyes. "Don't even get me started on that essay about symbolism. I swear she finds hidden meanings in everything. Next, she'll be telling us that the cafeteria lunch trays represent the struggles of modern society." David laughed so hard he almost choked on his sandwich. "Oh man, you're probably giving her ideas. Tomorrow we'll have a pop quiz on the metaphorical significance of chicken nuggets." As they continued talking and eating, David noticed that other kids at nearby tables were watching them with curious looks. Kevin had been sitting alone for weeks now, and seeing him laugh and talk with someone was probably a surprise to most people. But David didn't care about the stares. He was just happy to see his classmate looking more like himself again. When Kevin finished the sandwich half, David pushed the bag of chips toward him without saying anything. Kevin started to protest, but David just shook his head. "My mom packed these too, and I'm seriously going to explode if I eat another bite." By the time the lunch period was ending, Kevin looked like a completely different person. He was sitting up straighter, smiling more, and even joking around about their upcoming science test. As they packed up their things, Kevin turned to David with a serious expression. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for the food, just thanks." David nodded, understanding exactly what Kevin meant. "No problem, man. Same time tomorrow?" Kevin's face lit up. "Yeah, same time tomorrow." As they walked back toward their classrooms, David felt something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with the food he'd just eaten. His mom had always told him that the best way to feel good about yourself was to make someone else feel good too. He'd never really understood what she meant before, but walking down that hallway with Kevin, seeing his new friend smile and joke around like a regular kid again, David finally got it. Sometimes the smallest gestures made the biggest difference, and sometimes sharing what you had even when you didn't have much to begin with was the most powerful thing you could do. Mrs. Rodriguez had been working as a school counselor for 15 years, and in that time, she had developed what her colleagues jokingly called a sixth sense for spotting kids who needed help. It wasn't really magic, of course. It was just years of watching, listening, and caring enough to notice the small details that other adults might miss. That Tuesday afternoon, she was sitting in the cafeteria during lunch period, not because she was particularly hungry, but because lunchtime was when kids were most themselves. Away from the pressure of tests and assignments, their real personalities came out. Their real problems, too. She had been keeping an eye on Kevin for the past few weeks. His English teacher had mentioned that his grades were slipping and that he seemed distracted in class. More concerning was the fact that Kevin's mom had missed their scheduled parent conference last week without calling to reschedule. Mrs. Rodriguez had tried calling the house several times, but the phone seemed to be disconnected. As she watched Kevin walk into the cafeteria that day, Mrs. Rodriguez felt her heart sink a little. The boy looked tired and thin, and he moved through the lunch line without taking any food. Instead, he found an empty table and sat down with just his backpack, pulling out what looked like homework to keep himself busy. Mrs. Rodriguez was just about to get up and approach Kevin when something interesting happened. David, a boy from Kevin's English class, got up from his own table and walked over to sit with Kevin. Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed David before too, but for different reasons. He was one of those naturally kind kids who seemed to float through the school making friends with everyone. Teachers loved him because he was polite and worked hard, even though his grades weren't always perfect. From where she sat, Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't hear what the boys were talking about, but she could see David breaking his sandwich in half and pushing part of it across the table to Kevin. She watched Kevin's face carefully, seeing the internal struggle between pride and hunger, between wanting to maintain dignity and needing help. What struck Mrs. Rodriguez most was how naturally David handled the situation. There was no big announcement, no dramatic gesture that would embarrass Kevin in front of the other students. David just shared his food like it was the most normal thing in the world, like he was doing himself a favor rather than helping someone else. As the boys continued eating and talking, Mrs. Rodriguez found herself smiling. In all her years as a counselor, she had seen plenty of adults struggle to help kids with the same sensitivity that David was showing naturally. The boy had an instinct for kindness that couldn't be taught in any training program. But as she watched the interaction unfold, Mrs. Rodriguez also found herself wondering about David's own situation. She knew that David lived with just his mom, and that his mom worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. She had seen David's name on the list of students who qualified for free lunch, though she noticed he never actually used the program. Pride ran in families sometimes, and she suspected David might be going without lunch more often than anyone realized. Over the next few days, Mrs. Rodriguez made it her business to observe both boys more closely. She started eating her lunch in the cafeteria every day, always choosing a table where she could see David and Kevin without being obvious about it. What she discovered both warmed her heart and worried her at the same time. David continued sharing his lunch with Kevin every single day. Not just the main part of his meal, but his snacks, his drinks, even the quarters his mom gave him for the vending machine. Kevin was clearly grateful, and his mood and energy improved dramatically over the week. He started participating more in class, his homework quality went up, and he even joined in on some conversations with other students. But David was paying a price for his generosity. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that he was eating less and less each day, often finishing lunch period with just a few bites of food. She saw him drinking water from the fountain to fill his stomach, and she caught him nodding off during his afternoon classes. One day she even saw him quietly ask the school nurse for a headache pill, claiming he wasn't feeling well. The situation became even more complex when Mrs. Rodriguez decided to do some discreet investigating into both families' circumstances. What she discovered made her realize just how remarkable David's generosity really was. Kevin's family was indeed struggling. His father had lost his job at the manufacturing plant 6 weeks earlier, and his mother was working part-time at a grocery store while trying to take care of Kevin's younger sister. The family had applied for assistance programs, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and in the meantime, they were doing their best to stretch every dollar. Kevin's mom had been skipping meals herself to make sure her children ate, but even that sacrifice wasn't enough to provide lunch money for school. David's situation wasn't much better. His mother worked an early morning shift at a local diner, and then spent her afternoons cleaning offices downtown. She barely made enough to cover their rent and basic expenses, and Mrs. Rodriguez could see from the school records that they qualified for multiple assistance programs that they weren't using. David's mom was probably too proud to apply, just like her son was too proud to use the free lunch program. The irony wasn't lost on Mrs. Rodriguez. Here was a boy who needed help himself, giving away what little he had to help someone else who needed it even more. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. On Friday of that week, Mrs. Rodriguez witnessed something that made her realize she couldn't just observe anymore. She had to act. David came to lunch that day looking particularly tired. His mom had been working extra shifts to try to save up for their monthly bills, which meant David had been getting up early to walk himself to school instead of getting a ride. He sat down with Kevin as usual, but Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that his lunch that day was smaller than normal. Just a single sandwich, no sides, no snacks. Without hesitation, David split the sandwich in half and gave Kevin his portion, just like always. But this time, when Kevin offered to share it back, David shook his head and insisted that Kevin eat it all. "I had a big breakfast," David lied smoothly. "I'm not that hungry today." Mrs. Rodriguez watched David spend the entire lunch period drinking water and chatting with Kevin, pretending he wasn't hungry while his friend ate the only food at the table. She saw David's hands shake slightly from low blood sugar, saw him press his palm against his stomach when he thought no one was looking. That's when Mrs. Rodriguez knew she had seen enough. This wasn't just a sweet story about kids helping kids anymore. This was a situation where two families were struggling, and a 12-year-old boy was sacrificing his own health to help his friend. It was admirable, but it wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't fair to either child. As the lunch period ended and the boys packed up their things, Mrs. Rodriguez made her decision. She had connections throughout the community, relationships built over years of helping families navigate difficult times. She knew business owners who cared about local kids. She knew community organizations that existed specifically to help families like David's and Kevin's. And she knew that sometimes it just took one adult willing to make some phone calls to change everything. But she also knew that any help would have to be offered carefully. Both boys had pride, and both families would resist charity that felt like charity. The solution would need to be creative, dignified, and sustainable. As she walked back to her office, Mrs. Rodriguez was already forming a plan. She thought about Principal Johnson, who had grown up poor himself and understood the delicate balance between helping kids and preserving their dignity. She thought about the local businesses that had partnership programs with the school, and about the community members who were always looking for ways to give back. Most of all, she thought about David, who was teaching the entire school a lesson about compassion without even realizing it. If a 12-year-old could see a problem and take action to solve it, even at personal cost, then surely the adults in the community could step up and support both boys. Mrs. Rodriguez sat down at her desk and reached for her phone. It was time to turn one student's quiet act of kindness into something bigger, something that could help not just David and Kevin, but other kids who might be facing the same struggles. Sometimes it took a village to raise a child, but sometimes it just took one observant adult who cared enough to make a few phone calls. Principal Johnson was just finishing his second cup of coffee when Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on his office door that Friday morning. He could tell from her expression that this wasn't going to be a routine check-in about schedules or paperwork. In his 12 years as a principal, he had learned to read the faces of his staff members, and Mrs. Rodriguez had the look of someone who had discovered something important. "Come in. Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "You look like you've got something on your mind." Mrs. Rodriguez settled into her chair and took a deep breath. "I need to tell you about something that's been happening in our cafeteria," she began, and then she told him everything she had observed about David and Kevin over the past week. As Principal Johnson listened, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It was the same feeling he got whenever he encountered a situation that reminded him of his own childhood. Growing up in a single-parent household in the inner city, he had been both David and Kevin at different times in his life. He knew what it felt like to be hungry at school, and he knew what it felt like to want to help a friend even when you didn't have much to give. "So this boy David has been giving away his lunch every day for a week?" Principal Johnson asked, wanting to make sure he understood the situation correctly. "Every day," Mrs. Rodriguez confirmed. "And not just his lunch. His snacks, his drink money, everything. Yesterday I watched him give Kevin his entire sandwich and then spend the lunch period drinking water from the fountain, because he said he wasn't hungry." Principal Johnson rubbed his temples. This was exactly the kind of situation that kept him awake at night. Kids helping kids was beautiful, but when it meant a child was going hungry, it became a problem that required adult intervention. "What do we know about their family situations?" he asked. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out a folder she had prepared. "I did some research yesterday afternoon. Kevin's dad lost his job 6 weeks ago. The family is waiting for assistance programs to kick in, but you know how slow that process can be. Kevin's mom is working part-time, but it's not enough to cover everything, including school lunches." She flipped to another page. "David's situation is similar. His mom works 2 jobs but still barely makes ends meet. They qualify for our free lunch program, but David has never applied. I suspect it's a pride issue for both him and his mom." Principal Johnson nodded slowly. Pride was something he understood well. His own mother had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, and she had always insisted that they didn't need charity, even when they clearly did. It had taken him years to understand that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was just part of being human. "What's your recommendation?" he asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "I think we need to address this carefully," she said. "If we just offer free lunch to both families, they might refuse. And if we make too big a deal about David's kindness, we risk embarrassing Kevin or Ma. Making other kids feel bad about not being as generous." Principal Johnson leaned back in his chair and thought about the situation. He had dealt with similar cases before, but each one required a different approach. Sometimes the solution was as simple as connecting families with existing resources. Other times it required more creative thinking. "Let me make some phone calls," he said finally. "Give me the weekend to work on this. I have some ideas, but I want to do this right." After Mrs. Rodriguez left his office, Principal Johnson sat alone with his thoughts for several minutes. Then he picked up his phone and started dialing. His first call was to Janet Miller, who ran the community outreach program for the school district. Janet had been working with local families for over 20 years, and she had a network of resources that most people didn't even know existed. "Janet, it's Tom Johnson at Jefferson Middle School," he said when she answered. I've got a situation that I think you might be able to help with." He explained the situation with David and Kevin, and Janet listened carefully. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You know," she said slowly, "this reminds me of a program we started at Roosevelt Elementary last year. We called it the Weekend Backpack Program. Local businesses sponsor backpacks full of easy-to-prepare meals that kids can take home for the weekends. The beauty of it is that we provide them to all students who want them, so there's no stigma attached." Principal Johnson felt a spark of excitement. "Tell me more about how that works." "Well, we partner with local grocery stores and restaurants. They donate non-perishable items and volunteers pack the backpacks every Friday afternoon. Students can pick them up discreetly as they're leaving school, or we can have them delivered to their classrooms. The key is making it feel like a community program rather than a charity handout." They talked for another 20 minutes about the logistics of potentially starting a similar program at Jefferson Middle School. By the time Principal Johnson hung up, he was already envisioning how it might work. His next call was to Mike Peterson, who owned 3 restaurants in town and had always been supportive of school programs. Mike listened to the story and immediately offered to donate food for weekend backpacks, but then he had an even better idea. "You know what, Tom? This story about David giving away his lunch every day, that's exactly the kind of thing our community needs to hear about. Not to embarrass the kid or anything, but to inspire other people to get involved. What if we could find a way to recognize his kindness while also addressing the bigger problem?" Principal Johnson found himself nodding, even though Mike couldn't see him through the phone. "I was thinking along similar lines. Maybe some kind of assembly or recognition ceremony?" "Exactly," Mike said. "And we could use that as a launch point for a broader program. I bet if people heard this story, we'd have more volunteers and donors than we'd know what to do with." The conversation with Mike led to more phone calls. Principal Johnson called the president of the local Rotary Club, who immediately offered to sponsor the weekend backpack program. He called the manager of the biggest grocery store in town, who agreed to provide food donations. He even called the high school's National Honor Society sponsor, who volunteered students to help pack the backpacks every week. By Sunday evening, Principal Johnson had a comprehensive plan. But more importantly, he had something he hadn't expected to find: a community that was ready and eager to help. The plan he developed was multifaceted. First, there would be the Weekend Backpack Program, which would provide meals for students to take home. This would help families like Kevin's and David's without singling them out specifically. Second, there would be a peer support program where students could anonymously refer classmates who might need help with various issues. Third, and most importantly, there would be a recognition assembly where David's kindness would be celebrated and used as inspiration for school-wide initiatives. The key to the whole plan was dignity. Every aspect had been designed to help students and families without making them feel like charity cases. The Weekend Backpack Program would be open to all students, not just those who qualified based on income. The peer support program would be completely anonymous, and the recognition assembly would focus on inspiring others rather than singling out individual students' needs. On Monday morning, Principal Johnson called Mrs. Rodriguez into his office to share his plan. "This is amazing," she said after he had finished explaining everything. "But are you sure it's all going to work?" "It seems almost too good to be true," Principal Johnson smiled. "You know what I learned growing up poor? Communities are full of people who want to help. They just don't always know how. Sometimes it takes one story, one example of kindness to show them what's possible." He pulled out a calendar and started marking dates. "I want to have the assembly this Friday. That gives us a week to get everything organized. Can you reach out to David's and Kevin's families to make sure they're comfortable with David being recognized publicly?" "I'll take care of that today," Mrs. Rodriguez promised. As she left his office, Principal Johnson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just hope that they could solve David's and Kevin's immediate problems, but hope that they were about to create something much bigger, something that would change the entire culture of their school and maybe even their community. He picked up his phone to make one more call. This time he was calling the local newspaper. If this was going to work, if this was really going to make a difference, then everyone needed to hear about the 12-year-old boy who gave away his lunch every day, and the community that decided to make sure no child would ever have to choose between eating and helping a friend again. Sometimes, the best solution started with the smallest acts of kindness, and sometimes it just took one adult who cared enough to make a few phone calls to turn that kindness into something extraordinary. David had no idea what was coming when Principal Johnson's voice crackled over the intercom that Friday morning, announcing a special assembly during third period. All students and staff should report to the gymnasium at 10:30 for a celebration of kindness and community, the principal had said, his voice carrying an unusual excitement that made David wonder what was going on. As David walked toward the gym with his classmates, he noticed that Kevin seemed nervous. His friend kept fidgeting with his backpack straps and glancing around like he was expecting something to happen. But when David asked if he was okay, Kevin just shrugged and said he was fine. The gymnasium was buzzing with energy when they arrived. Students filled the bleachers while teachers lined the walls, and David could see several adults he didn't recognize sitting in folding chairs near the stage. There was something official about the whole setup that made his stomach flutter with curiosity. Principal Johnson took the microphone and waited for the room to quiet down. When he spoke, his voice carried through the speakers with a warmth that immediately captured everyone's attention. "Good morning, Jefferson Middle School," he began. "I've called this assembly today because something special has been happening in our school, and I think it's time everyone knew about it." David shifted in his seat, wondering what Principal Johnson could be talking about. He glanced around the gym and noticed Mrs. Rodriguez standing near the stage, smiling in his direction. That made him even more curious. "Over the past few weeks," Principal Johnson continued, "I've learned about acts of kindness happening right here in our cafeteria. Acts of kindness that remind us what it means to be part of a community that cares about each other." The principal's words seemed to echo in David's ears, and he felt a strange tingling sensation in his chest. Surely this wasn't about him sharing his lunch with Kevin. That was just what friends did for each other, wasn't it? "There's a student in this room," Principal Johnson said, his voice growing stronger, "who has been quietly, without any recognition or fanfare, sharing his lunch every single day with a classmate who needed it, not just once or twice, but every day for weeks." David's face grew hot, and he could feel his classmates looking around, trying to figure out who the principal was talking about. Next to him, Kevin had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Principal Johnson with an expression David couldn't quite read. "This student didn't ask for anything in return," the principal continued. "He didn't make a big show of his generosity. He just saw someone who needed help and decided to share what he had, even though his own family doesn't have much to spare." Now David was certain the principal was talking about him, and he wished he could disappear into the bleachers. His face felt like it was on fire, and he could hear whispers starting around him as other students began to put the pieces together. "David Thompson," Principal Johnson said clearly, "could you please come down to the stage?" The gymnasium erupted in applause, and David felt his legs go weak. He had never heard his name announced over a microphone before, and the sound of it echoing through the gym made everything feel surreal. Kevin grabbed his arm and whispered, "Go on, man. You deserve this." Walking down to the stage felt like walking through a dream. David could see faces in the crowd, some surprised, some smiling, some nodding like they had suspected all along. His teachers were beaming at him, and he caught sight of his mom near the back of the gym. Wait, his mom? How was she here? She was supposed to be at work. When David reached the stage, Principal Johnson put a hand on his shoulder and spoke into the microphone again. "David, what you've been doing in our cafeteria represents the very best of what it means to be part of a school community. You saw someone who needed help and you helped them, without expecting anything in return." The applause continued, but David barely heard it. He was still trying to process how his mom had gotten there, and why there were so many adults he didn't recognize sitting in the front row. "But here's the really amazing part of this story," Principal Johnson continued. "When our community heard about David's kindness, they decided they wanted to do something about it. They wanted to make sure that no student in our school ever has to choose between eating their own lunch and helping a friend." One of the unfamiliar adults stood up from the front row. He was a middle-aged man in a business suit who walked with confidence and smiled warmly as he approached the microphone. "My name is Mike Peterson," he said, "and I own 3 restaurants here in town. When Principal Johnson told me about David's story, I knew I had to get involved. David, you've inspired our entire business community to take action." Mike turned to address the whole gymnasium. "Starting Monday, Jefferson Middle School will be launching something called the Weekend Backpack Program. Every Friday, students who want them can pick up backpacks filled with easy-to-prepare meals to take home for the weekend. And this program will be available to any student who wants it, no questions asked. The applause was deafening now, but Mike wasn't finished. We've also set up a peer support network, where students can anonymously help classmates who might be struggling with different challenges. And all of this started because one young man decided to share his sandwich. David felt overwhelmed. This was so much bigger than he had ever imagined. He had just been trying to help Kevin, and somehow it had turned into this huge community program. Another adult stepped forward, an older woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Janet Miller from the school district's community outreach program. "David, your generosity has created a ripple effect," she said. "We've had over 50 volunteers sign up to help with the weekend backpack program. 3 grocery stores have agreed to donate food regularly. The high school's National Honor Society has committed to packing backpacks every week. All because you showed us what kindness looks like." Principal Johnson took the microphone back and looked directly at David. "But we didn't bring you up here just to put you in the spotlight," he said gently. "We brought you up here because we wanted to thank you, and because we wanted to present you with something." Mike Peterson handed Principal Johnson a beautiful plaque, which the principal then presented to David. The plaque read, "Community Hero Award, presented to David Thompson for demonstrating exceptional kindness and inspiring others to action." As David held the plaque, still trying to process everything that was happening, Principal Johnson spoke once more to the assembled students. "I want everyone in this room to understand something," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that made everyone pay attention. David didn't do what he did because he wanted recognition. He did it because he saw someone who needed help, and he helped them. That's what real kindness looks like. It's not about getting credit or being noticed. It's about caring for each other. The principal paused, letting his words sink in. "And here's what I want you all to remember. Every single one of you has the power to make a difference in someone's life. You don't have to do something huge or dramatic. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes." As the assembly began to wind down, students started lining up to shake David's hand or pat him on the back. Some of them told him they had always thought he was cool. Others said they wanted to volunteer for the new programs that had been announced. But the moment that meant the most to David came when Kevin appeared at his side. His friend's eyes were shiny with tears, but he was smiling bigger than David had seen him smile in weeks. "Thank you," Kevin said simply, but David could hear everything else his friend wanted to say in those 2 words. "You don't have to thank me," David replied. "That's what friends do." As they walked back toward the bleachers together, David felt something different in the air around them. It wasn't just that the assembly had been exciting, or that he had been recognized for helping Kevin. It was something bigger than that. Looking around the gymnasium, David could see students talking excitedly about the new programs that had been announced. He could see teachers making plans and adult volunteers exchanging contact information. He could see his mom wiping away proud tears and Kevin standing a little taller than he had in weeks. What started as one boy sharing his sandwich had somehow become an entire community, deciding to take care of each other. And as David looked around at all the faces, all the people who had been inspired to help, he realized that this was what adults meant when they talked about making a difference in the world. Sometimes it really did start with something as simple as sharing your lunch with a friend who needed it. And sometimes, if you were really lucky, that simple act of kindness could inspire an entire community to be better. 3 months had passed since the assembly, and Jefferson Middle School felt like a completely different place. David could feel the change the moment he walked through the front doors each morning. There was something lighter in the air, something warmer in the way students greeted each other in the hallways. The weekend backpack program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a simple idea to help a few struggling families had turned into something much bigger. Every Friday afternoon, nearly 80 students lined up in the main office to pick up their weekend backpacks, filled with everything from instant oatmeal and peanut butter sandwiches to fresh fruit and homemade cookies donated by community members. David had been amazed to discover how many of his classmates had been quietly dealing with food insecurity. Students he never would have suspected, kids who seemed to have everything together, were among the regular backpack recipients. The program had removed the shame from needing help, and that had made all the difference. But the backpack program was just the beginning. The peer support network that had been announced at the assembly had taken on a life of its own. Students could drop anonymous notes in special boxes placed around the school, either asking for help themselves or suggesting that someone else might need support. Mrs. Rodriguez and a team of volunteer teachers followed up on every single note, connecting students with resources ranging from tutoring help to warm winter coats. David had become an unofficial ambassador for the program, though he still felt a little weird about being called a community hero. Principal Johnson had asked him to speak to groups of elementary school students about kindness and helping others, and David had discovered that he actually enjoyed talking to the younger kids. They asked great questions and seemed genuinely excited about the idea of helping their classmates. The most surprising development had been the creation of something students had started calling David's Table. It wasn't anything official, and David himself had nothing to do with organizing it. It had just evolved naturally in the cafeteria. Every day, students who were eating alone, or who seemed like they might want some company, gravitated toward the table where David and Kevin usually sat. Before long, the table had expanded to include students from different grades, different social groups, different backgrounds. There were kids who were new to the school, kids who were shy, kids who were dealing with problems at home, and kids who just wanted to be part of something welcoming and inclusive. The only unspoken rule at David's table was that everyone was welcome, and no one ate alone. Mrs. Rodriguez had told Principal Johnson that lunch referrals to her office had dropped by more than half since David's Table had become a fixture in the cafeteria. Students were finding their own support systems, creating their own communities of care. The changes weren't limited to Jefferson Middle School either. The story of David's generosity had spread throughout the school district, and other schools had started their own versions of the weekend backpack program. The local newspaper had written a follow-up article about the community response, and schools in neighboring towns had reached out for advice on starting similar initiatives. David's mom had been affected by the changes too, though in ways David was only beginning to understand. 2 weeks after the assembly, Mike Peterson had approached her about a job opening at one of his restaurants. The position paid better than her other 2 jobs combined, and it came with health insurance and a schedule that would let her be home in the evenings with David. "I don't want you to think this is charity," Mike had told her when he offered her the job. "I need a good assistant manager, and everyone I've talked to says you're one of the hardest workers in town. Your son's kindness just gave me an excuse to finally do something I should have done months ago." Kevin's situation had improved dramatically as well. His father had found work through a connection made at the assembly when community members learned about the family's situation. It wasn't the same job he had lost, but it was steady work with decent pay, and it had given the whole family a sense of stability they hadn't felt in months. But for Kevin, the most important change was simply having friends again. The shame and isolation he had felt when his family was struggling had melted away, replaced by the knowledge that people cared about him and wanted to help. He had joined the student council and was working with David to plan more community service projects for the school. On this particular Friday afternoon, David was sitting at his usual table in the cafeteria, surrounded by the mix of students who had become his regular lunch companions. There was Ashley, who had moved to town from across the country and had been eating alone for weeks before finding David's table. There was Michael, whose parents were going through a difficult divorce and who needed the stability of friends who didn't ask too many questions. There was Lisa, who struggled with anxiety and had found comfort in the accepting atmosphere of the group. And of course, there was Kevin, who had become David's closest friend and partner in all the community service projects they had gotten involved in. "So what's the plan for next week's canned food drive?" asked Ashley, unwrapping a sandwich that looked suspiciously similar to the ones that came in the weekend backpacks. "We're hoping to collect enough food to stock the local food bank through the winter," Kevin replied, consulting a notebook where he kept track of all their projects. "Mrs. Rodriguez thinks we can beat last year's record if we really push for participation." David listened to his friends making plans and felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the food he was eating. This table, these friendships, this whole community of caring that had grown up around them, it all felt bigger than anything he could have imagined when he first shared his sandwich with Kevin. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been the smallest one. Every day, David still shared his lunch, not because Kevin needed it anymore, but because sharing had become such a natural part of who he was. Sometimes he shared with Ashley when she forgot her lunch money. Sometimes he shared with new students who looked overwhelmed by their first day. Sometimes he shared just because it felt good to make sure everyone at his table had enough to eat. The difference was that now he wasn't the only one sharing. Every student at David's table had picked up the habit. They shared food, they shared homework help, they shared friendship with anyone who needed it. The spirit of generosity had become contagious, spreading from one act of kindness to an entire culture of caring. Principal Johnson still stopped by the cafeteria most days during lunch period, and David could often see him watching David's table with a satisfied smile. A few weeks earlier, the principal had pulled David aside to tell him something that had stuck with him ever since. "You know, David," Principal Johnson had said, "when I was your age, I thought making a difference in the world meant doing something huge and dramatic. I thought you had to be famous or powerful or special in some way, but you've taught me that the most powerful thing anyone can do is just care about the people around them." As David looked around the table at his friends, all of them laughing and talking and including each other in their conversations, he thought about what Principal Johnson had said. He thought about how different everything had become, and how it had all started with something as simple as noticing that someone was hungry and deciding to help. The weekend backpack program was helping dozens of families. The peer support network was connecting students with resources they needed. David's table was making sure no one had to eat alone. And all of it had grown out of one moment when David had chosen kindness over comfort, generosity over keeping what was his. But as proud as David was of everything that had happened, what made him happiest was much simpler. It was the fact that Kevin was laughing at something Ashley had said, that Michael was helping Lisa with her math homework, that everyone at the table felt like they belonged somewhere. Sometimes the biggest changes really did start with the smallest actions. Sometimes sharing your sandwich with someone who needed it could create ripples that spread further than you ever imagined. And sometimes, if you were really lucky, those ripples could change an entire community. One act of kindness at a time. David finished his lunch and started clearing his tray, already looking forward to Monday when they would all gather around the table again. Because that's what friends did. They showed up for each other, they shared what they had, and they made sure everyone knew they weren't alone. In the end, that was what making a difference really meant. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but simply caring enough to share your lunch with someone who needed it, and trusting that kindness would find a way to grow.